Hello! Welcome to the very first episode of TDWrites. I'm your host, Peter Vaughn. I'm a young 24-year-old author. Either, if you want to call that young. Some people do, most people do. I'm young, 24-year-old author. I've published 3 ebooks, full of short stories and poems and stuff like that, and I've also published a novel. I've been writing for more than half my life, and man, I love it. And I figure I have so many short stories and so many poems. I want to share some of those with you. And also, we're recording this at the end of April, deep into the heart of quarantine season, and it's time to make some content. Let's make some content, you know? I want to deliver content right to your ears. So wherever you are, whether you're listening to this at work, at home, in your car, in the shower, wherever you are, I hope you enjoy these stories that I'm going to deliver to your ear holes. I'm going to also talk about them, my thought process behind them, what I think they mean and signify. One of my writing philosophies and the philosophies behind my stories is they are not for me to define, they're not my stories. They are yours, the readers, or in this case, the listener's stories. So, your interpretations matter to me. So come up with your own interpretations, I'll tell you mine as we read these stories. I hope you enjoy, and this will be a fun ride. In today's pilot episode, we will be reading a short story called The Dragon Prince, a poem I wrote called Leaving, and finally, a short story I wrote called My Friend. Though he ruled the lands, he refused to be called king. He'd never admit it, but his humility was too great. The king knew he was only a servant to his people and to the one true king. Therefore, the people called him Good Simon. Good Simon was dying. The attack from Abiel's forces had been quick but deadly. Like a flood, black-clad knights emerged from sewers, scaled the walls, and charged through the main gate. The people of Tigressia fought along the Lacendians, but it was still a bloody battle. Ted, a Lacendian boy of no more than 17, held Good Simon's hand. The lad had seen friends and comrades die, allies from numerous cities, and even been a comfort to enemies as they drifted off into the dark. It never got easier. "Listen to me, boy," the king said as he grimaced in pain. His long beard was soaked in his own blood, but he still clung to life. "My son will be left alone when I am gone. His mother died in childbirth. I imagine I'll see her when I am gone, when I join my master. But the child must be cared for." Simon grabbed Ted by the collar and brought him closer as his voice grew dim. The sun was beginning to set, casting a beautiful red hue over the beautiful city of Tigressia. "Tell no one what I tell you. Take my son into the caves a mile west of here. Bring no weapon and wear no armor. There you will meet the boy's godmother. She will raise him in my stead." Good Simon's grip weakened, but Ted still held his hand. His head fell to the ground, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Until we meet on the other side, Theodore. All my love to my son and to you and yours." Ted's commander Rupees ran up to the pair, bandages and herbs in hand, but it was too late. The ruler of Tigressia had slipped off into another great adventure. It was late that night when the funeral pyres were erected and lit. The death toll was low, surprisingly. A few dozen Tigressians and a handful of Lacendian soldiers had died. The entire city gathered outside the walls to celebrate the lives of their soldiers and their king. Ted's closest friend, Beth, held Simon's young son. He was only 6 months old, and seeing him in Beth's arms melted the teenager's heart. Ted had been strong this time. He hadn't cried as Simon died, and he didn't cry as he watched the king slowly turn to ash. But seeing his little boy, his tiny face lit by the bonfire, Ted couldn't help but weep. He and Beth sat in the nursery that night as the child slept. Ted envied the baby, in a way. He has no idea what happened. In his ignorance, he avoids such heartbreak. The teenagers didn't talk, but simply sat in each other's company. All the death Ted had witnessed had made his stomach turn. Here sat the girl of his dreams, and what worried him the most was that she would never know how he felt. Yet, still he said nothing. With the crack of dawn, Ted awoke. Granted, he hadn't slept that night, but he shook free of his trance and rose. Beth had fallen fast asleep, unconsciously rocking slightly in a rocking chair. The baby slept as well, and Ted quietly placed the baby in a wicker basket, wrapped in a blanket. "Time to go, Scooter," the young man whispered. As stealthy as the wind, Ted slipped out of the castle and began his trek west. He wore only a leather tunic and trousers, and he left his sword behind, resting by Beth. The sun cast no warmth on him as it began to rise, and Ted shivered in the early morning chill. A small wooden sign stood in front of the cave, warning off any explorers. Tigressian Caves, no entry, extreme danger. Ted glanced at the cave, back to the city, and then down at the basket. The child still slept, but the teenager hesitated. Why would the child's godmother be living in these caves? And why would there be such danger here? Apprehensively, the young man walked inside. There were small holes in the roof of the cavern every so often, letting in tiny sunbeams and casting a soft light across the cave. Ted watched his step closely, praying he would not lose his footing and drop the baby. "Hello?" he called. "I am searching for the guardian of Simon's son." "Who goes there?" a raspy voice asked, echoing inside Ted's mind. The adolescent began to panic. That wasn't my voice, he thought. He hadn't heard it, but still it rattled around in his head. "Speak now, child, or prepare to die." "Wait." Ted put the baby down gently and raised his hands. "I bring you no harm. I'm just delivering good Simon's son to you. The king is dead, and he asked me to bring you his child. He said you would care for him." A booming footstep shook Ted and woke the baby inside the basket. Rather than crying, the child began to giggle as the footsteps began to draw closer. The morning light broke through the cave and fell upon a major dragon. Ted nearly fell over. "Simon is dead? How did it happen?" The dragon spoke directly into Ted's mind. Its mouth did not move. Though his mouth moved, Ted couldn't speak. He had seen some riding dragons, of course, and Beth befriended a 1-inch-long minor dragon, but never had Ted imagined he would run into a 30-feet-long major dragon. Was it a Bayo? The dragon frowned, and his brow furrowed. The young man could only nod. With a mighty huff and a plume of smoke which billowed from her nostrils, the dragon looked down at the king's son. "I'll care for the child, as if he was my own son. I swear it on my life, on the scales of my back." "Why did good Simon choose you to care for his son?" Ted managed to ask, though his lips were incredibly dry and his knees shook. "When he rose to power in Tigressia, I sought his friendship and alliance with him, and surprisingly, we became like siblings. Never have I known a man who loves like he did." The teenager hung his head. "I'm sorry for your loss. He trusted you enough to send me here, I can tell you that." The dragon had no reply, but she whipped her tail around and threw the handle of the basket. With another deep sigh, the mighty worm turned and retreated deeper into the cave. Ted watched the pair leave, and wondered what would become of the child, the king's baby, the Dragon Prince. So yeah, the Dragon Prince. That's a recent story I wrote. I wrote that 2 days ago from this recording. What day? April the 24th. Yeah, I like it a lot. One thing you're gonna have to learn about me, if this podcast continues, is I write a lot about dragons. I just really love dragons. I don't know why. Maybe I just love fantasy too much, and dragons are very prevalent in fantasy. Love the idea of dragons. So, yep, story about a dragon, a godmother dragon. Also, loosely set in the Between Nights universe from my novel. It's a story that I will probably implement into the sequel at some point, but it has not yet been woven in. I really like the character of Good Simon, like a king that doesn't want to be called king. That's very interesting. I wrote another story, in another city that Ted goes to, where it's, instead of a king, they have a mayor. It's the only city he ever goes to where there's a mayor instead of a king. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm trying to vary the cities up and not just have them all be the same thing, you know? Dragons, speaking with their mind is, lore I sorta came up with. It's not incredibly original, but the way dragons work in this world or whatnot, there's major dragons, which are the big traditional 30 feet long dragons or whatnot, breathe fire. They can speak with their minds. They're telepaths, intelligent creatures, crafty, traditionally live in caves and whatnot, lonely and introverts and whatnot. Not necessarily introverts, they're dragons, but they live by themselves for the most part. Then there's riding dragons, which the heroes ride around on. They're smaller dragons, like horses basically, but dragons obviously. And then there's minor dragons, which are little tiny, less than a foot long dragons. Yeah, and I don't know, I think dragons, I'm not quite sure the plot line of Between Nights sequel, but I think dragons will be playing a big role in the book. Leaving. Mom needed to stay, but I was healthy, so I left. When I didn't spend my time crying, eating, or leaving surprises for my parents, I left my waking state and dreamt of the warmth I had left. I left for church and delighted at meeting all my new friends. I left for the hospital. I left to examine the new car we had, so much larger and more spectacular than I expected. I left to greet a new, younger face. I left for my first sleepover. I left my room, searching for more baby powder to decorate my room with. I left my clean room. I left to visit my grandmother in the desert. I left the hot sun. I left the new video game system at my uncle's house, although involuntarily. We said goodbye, and I left, a new system resting in my bag. I left to open Christmas presents at the hospital. I left for my first week of camp. I left camp kicking and screaming. I left to spend time with other homeschoolers. I left to perform in the Thanksgiving play, my abnormally large cardboard hat resting precariously on my head. I left my parents' meeting to play with a friend. I left the hospital in a wheelchair and with a crooked nose. I left my homework for later, electing to read Harry Potter instead. I left for the local middle school. I left missing homeschool. I left with 3 new textbooks and a humongous bag on my back. I left for the hospital. I left for another dreaded dentist visit. I left the school bus, sprinting away from the neighborhood bully. I left my math class with a low grade. I left for the hospital. I left for Disney World, excited for the coming week. I left amazed by the magic. I left for high school. I left disgusted by biology. I left for my friend's house. I left for the hospital, but not being able to see Mom in the ICU, I left. I left my childhood. I left for 10th grade, greeted by teachers that all said the same thing. I left. I left my dreams, disgusted by the real world. I left camp renewed. I left, absentmindedly thinking about one of my friends from youth group. I left lonely. Dad announced his engagement. I left. I left for a walk. I left for a walk. I left for a walk. I left for the wedding in a suit and tie. I left hating bagpipes. I left to volunteer in camp. I left wanting to stay. I left for senior year. I left with an honor roll achievement. I left to tour college. I left for a walk. I left to see old friends at camp, and I left with more new ones. I left for my first class, but being my first time, arrived late. I left feeling good anyway. I left for a walk. I left dreading the thought of taking computer class again. I left trying to erase the gloom of winter and accept the joy of summer. I left my lifeguard orientation fearing failure. I left the treehouse with my friends, having bonded even further than I thought possible. I left having a new appreciation for the djembe. I left with a lifeguard tan, stronger than before. I left depressed at the thought of not seeing my friends every day. I left for a walk, talking to no one in particular. I left for new classes. I left for a walk. My classmates loved my writing. I left with my self-esteem boosted. I left afraid of where I could sleep that night. I left the bus, greeted by an understanding friend and a cup of hot chocolate. I left my phone to charge, thanking God that at least my friends were worried if I was all right. I left for dinner and advice from some friends. I left for home, expecting a different greeting, and I left disappointed. Should I leave? That poem you just heard was called Leaving. I wrote this when I was, I want to say 19, maybe 20. I was a kid. It's been at least, probably about 5 years since I've written this. Maybe a little bit less, but I was going through a really rough period of my life. So I wrote this poem, which is basically an autobiography, the story of my life. I wrote this as an assignment for my creative writing class when I was going to community college the first time. And things just weren't looking so good. I had just finished the best job I ever had, and still to this day, it's the best job I've ever had. It was the best summer I've ever had. I worked up at camp, and I made really close friends. Learned a lot of stuff about myself that I never realized. And coming back to normal life made me realize that normal life wasn't really great. And then normal life started to get worse than it used to be. And it got really heavy. So there was one night I was just so down, and I was taking the train, and it was late at night. And I was just sitting there at the train station, and I wrote this. And as soon as I wrote it, I recorded an audio diary and read it, and I broke down crying while I was reading it. It was a heavy time. It really was. I don't write much poetry nowadays. There was one night, probably just a week or two before I wrote this, which is, I mentioned towards the end of the poem, where I had nowhere to sleep that night, and I was out on the street. And one of my friends took me in, because I texted him. I had 2% battery on my phone. I texted him. I said, I need to come over. And I couldn't really ask because my phone was gonna die. It's I'm coming over. I'm sorry, I'll talk to you when I get there, but I just need to come over. And I get off the bus to walk to his house, which was 2 blocks away. He's standing at the bus stop with a cup of coffee My phone was dead, so I had no idea that he would be there. He was standing there with a cup of coffee. Actually, it was hot chocolate. Man, where would I be without that guy? You know who you are. I've been really blessed. Yeah. But this poem means a lot to me. This is probably my favorite poem I've ever written. Maybe not. I'm not sure. I'd have to go through my poetry. But it's a heavy look into my life. My friend. I had a friend once. I didn't have many friends before him. I used to take money from people. It was my job. I wasn't stealing any money from people. Well, maybe the government was, but I might as well have been Satan incarnate. Everyone I worked with hated me, and I, for the most part, hated my job. I was completely alone, and I was shunned by my people. No one was friendly to me. Except him. He met me at work one day, when I had about half a dozen people yelling at me. And he came right up to me, and get this, he says just 2 words. He says, "Follow me." And I had heard of this guy before. He was pretty well known around the city, and the government hated him, and most of the people loved him. So I turn to one of my coworkers, and I say, "You've got this." And I get up, and I follow the guy. And when I say this, I'm being completely honest. He treated me like I was worth the world. That man loved me as though I was his brother. We ate together, we lived together, and we traveled the country. Because I was with him, people thought I was worth something too. They'd ask me to speak on his behalf. They'd ask me to give my friend gifts for them. Even just touching my clothes would make these people ecstatic. And then my friends said some things they didn't like. The crowds that had treated him like a celebrity before suddenly weren't too hot on the idea of spending time with my friend. And I might as well have been in my old job again. Lots of people started hating me again. My friend was arrested. The few friends I had made all disappeared underground. And I was nearly mugged myself a few times during that weekend. That Friday, I gather enough courage to venture outside of the city, and I see my friend executed, with a crowd of people standing there cheering on his death. I hope you've never seen one of your friends put to death, but if you have, you know how gut-wrenching it feels. I cried. It was horrible, and I too escaped. I hid underground, and I thought it was over. And then Mary came, pounding on my door, yelling the best news of my life. She burst into the room we were in and proclaimed that she had seen Jesus, and he was alive. So yeah, that short story was called My Friend. This one I wrote based on a writing prompt. A lot of stories I write, a lot of short stories I write are based on writing prompts. The first story we read today, what was that? The Dragon Prince was written based on a writing prompt of a dying king wants his child to grow up with his greatest friend as a guardian, so the child is brought to raised to by a dragon. This short story, I don't have the exact prompt in front of me, but it was something along the lines of write a story where we don't know if it's a sad story or a happy story until the last sentence. And I wrote it based on the story of Matthew, the tax collector, one of the disciples of Jesus. He is one of my favorite disciples. Because tax collectors in those days, they were hated. No one really liked a tax collector. And I can imagine if I was in Matthew's shoes, that would be pretty depressing. Not really being liked by your own people. You were a traitor. So having someone that actually loves you like you're worth the world would have been life-changing. So yeah, I wrote this story based on him. And yeah, I saved Jesus' resurrection in the story until the very last sentence. and Matthew doesn't even witness it in the story. I had a graphic novel of the 12 disciples and whatnot, and what their lives were like before Jesus, during Jesus, and after Jesus, according to church history. And Matthew's section of that book was kind of similar to this. It was just like, but it didn't know if he liked his job or didn't like his job, but it does know that after he met Jesus, he completely turned around. That was very cool. Matthew is definitely one of my favorite disciples of Jesus. And I didn't want to mention Jesus during this story, just so it's like fresh in your mind and it's not like, oh yeah, I know the story of Matthew. Or Levi, if you want to say Levi. Yeah, I like the story. I'm fond of it. And it's located in one of my books, Short Tales of Wondrous Things, which is my second book. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening to TDWrites. I'm your host, Peter Vaughn. You can find me on Twitter at TDWFan or at TDWrites. You can find me on Instagram at TDWFan. Reddit /r/TDWFan. You can find some short stories there. Yeah, if you liked it, get in contact with me. Tell me how you enjoyed the show. The entire show was produced and edited by me. Some music provided by DJ Quads and the YouTube audio library. I'll probably put that in the description for this episode. Yeah. Thank you so much for listening. And I might see you in the next one. We'll see how it goes. This is TDW. Delicious.